Ever get the feeling like someone's trying to sell you a version of the past that's uh, a little too perfect? Like maybe those good old days everyone talks about weren't so good for everyone, you
Well,
know?
it is interesting, isn't it, how easily we can kind of get swept up in nostalgia. We
Yeah.
crave those comforting memories, but sometimes those warm feelings, I think, they can actually make us miss the full picture.
That's what we're diving into today. These nostalgia necromancers,
Hmm.
they're not just, history buffs. They're twisting the past, often to make some pretty dark times seem glorious.
Right, yeah. They play on our longing for simpler times, but the past they're selling is often sanitized, scrubbed clean of the struggles of marginalized groups.
And that's not just misleading, it's dangerous. Like, it can be used to justify things happening right now. Putin's Holy Rust narrative comes to mind.
Oh, absolutely. That's a textbook example of what we call necropropaganda, using a warped version of history to push a political agenda. Putin's using this idealized past to try and make the invasion of Ukraine seem legitimate.
But wouldn't some people say any talk of the past is a bit nostalgic? How do we know when it crosses the line into harmful territory?
Good question. One red flag is when the past is presented as purely good or bad, with no shades of gray.
Right.
History is messy and complex. If someone's oversimplifying it, they're probably hiding something.
So it's not about dwelling on the negative, but about recognizing that the good old days weren't good for everyone.
Exactly. Take the 1950s in America. It's often portrayed as this idyllic time, but for Black Americans, it was an era of segregation and systemic racism. We can't just erase those experiences.
Okay, so how about the tactics these nostalgia necromancers use? I was reading about how they exploit something called generational amnesia. What exactly does that mean?
Think about it. You probably learned about certain historical events primarily through stories, not firsthand experience.
Right.
That gap in lived experience is where nostalgia necromancers step in. Younger generations didn't live through those times, so it's easier to fill in the blanks with a manipulated version of the past.
It's almost like they're taking advantage of the fact that we can't time travel to fact check everything.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just the stories they tell, it's the visuals too. Sepia tones, vintage aesthetics, it all triggers a warm, fuzzy feeling that makes us less critical.
It's kind of sneaky, actually. They're making manipulation look aesthetically pleasing.
Exactly. They weaponize aesthetics to bypass logic and go straight for your emotions. Think about those memes that use retro anime art to promote
Yeah.
less than savory ideologies.
Yeah.
It's a calculated tactic.
So if we're being bombarded with this stuff, how do we fight back? We need some serious historical anti-venom, right?
Well, the first step is being aware of the problem, which you're already doing by listening to this deep dive.
Right.
But beyond that, there are a few key strategies we can all employ. It's about becoming your own history detective.
So like what's the first clue we should be looking for?
Become a primary source sleuth. Seek out original documents, photos, accounts from people who actually lived through those times. Don't just rely on someone else's
I
interpretation.
love that. Become an archive anarchist.
Exactly. Question everything. Don't be afraid to dig a little deeper and then share what you find.
What about the tech angle? You mentioned using augmented reality to, well, digitally vandalize statues. Could you expand on that?
Think of it as reclaiming the narrative.
Okay.
Imagine pointing your phone at a Confederate monument and seeing it overlaid with facts about the slave trade. You're challenging the dominant narratives that have stood unchallenged for too long.
That's so cool. It's like rewriting history in real time. And what about the power of collecting oral histories?
Hmm?
That seems like a vital part of the anti-venom.
Absolutely. It's about preserving authentic voices before they're lost or distorted. Those firsthand accounts add a depth and nuance that textbooks often miss.
This is making me feel like we're not just passive recipients of history. We can actually shape how it's understood.
That's the point. We all have a role to play in combating historical revisionism.
And that brings us to some real-world examples of people doing just that. There's this incredible story of Dakota Raj in India.
Oh, yes, Raj. He realized that his textbook was glorifying British colonialism, calling it a period of development for India.
That's some serious rose-tinted glasses. What did he do?
Raj took action. He crowdsourced photos of the devastating famines that happened under British rule and printed them as stickers. Let's just say he helped his classmates see Winston Churchill in a new light.
Clever. He fought necropropaganda with primary sources. Proof that one person can make a difference.
It's inspiring, right? It shows the power of critical thinking, especially when it comes to the information we're given. But we also need to talk about the real-world harm these nostalgia necromancers can cause. It's not just about dusty old history books.
Right. It's happening right now. You mentioned Brazil earlier, how they're trying to rebrand their dictatorship's torture chambers.
It's chilling. There was a push in 2018 to reframe those centers as places of necessary discipline. And polls showed that a significant number of young people actually supported military rule.
It's like they're trying to make those torture centers seem okay and erase the suffering of those who are oppressed.
And it's not just happening in other countries. Look at the manufactured panic over critical race theory here in the U.S. They're trying to frame any discussion about slavery and Jim Crow as divisive and unpatriotic.
It's like they're trying to make progress feel unnatural. If everything was so great back then, why change anything?
Exactly. They're trying to lull us to sleep with this comfortable but ultimately false vision of the past.
So what can our listeners, the influence decoders out there, do about it?
The most important thing is to stay vigilant. Question the narratives you encounter, especially those that feel overly simplistic or romanticized. Dig deeper, do your own research, and don't be afraid to challenge those narratives. And if you come across a local example of necropropaganda, maybe a monument, a textbook, or even a family story that feels a little too good to be true, share it with us.
Yeah, we'd love to hear about it and maybe even feature it in a future deep dive.
You know what's really interesting about all of this? These narratives, they often tap into pre-existing anxieties in society.
Like what kind of anxieties?
Well, think about it. Times of rapid change or economic uncertainty can make people feel insecure.
Right.
They start to long for a perceived era of stability and order, and that's where nostalgia necromancers come in.
So they're offering a kind of false comfort. Like, don't worry, things used to be better. We just need to go back to the way things were.
Exactly. And that message can be really appealing to people who feel disenfranchised or left behind by societal changes. It gives them someone to blame and a simple solution.
Which is why it's so important to arm ourselves with the facts, to be able to counter those narratives with evidence.
Absolutely. And that's where those historical anti-venom strategies we talked about come in. Think about accounts like at History Crime Scene on social media. They do a great job of juxtaposing those romanticized images with the often harsh realities of the past.
It's like they're holding up a mirror to those overly perfect visions of history.
Exactly. And it can be really effective. It forces people to confront the difference between the nostalgic image and the historical reality.
Speaking of confronting uncomfortable truths, you mentioned unfiltered history tours earlier. What are those all about?
Those are all about reclaiming physical spaces and recontextualizing them with a more honest lens. Imagine walking through a historic Philadelphia neighborhood. But instead of just seeing the charming colonial architecture, you're also made aware of the bustling slave markets that once existed, just blocks away.
Wow, that would definitely change your perspective.
That's the goal, to make history more tangible, more relatable, and ultimately more honest.
We've talked about debunking nostalgic myths, but what about preserving authentic history? That's what oral histories come in, right?
Precisely. Recording the stories of people who lived through historical events is crucial. These firsthand accounts provide a depth and nuance that textbooks often miss.
It's a way of giving voice to those who might have been silenced or marginalized in official historical narratives. Their stories deserve to be heard.
Absolutely. It's about democratizing history, making sure that multiple perspectives are heard and preserved.
It's like we're all archivists in a way. We have a responsibility to collect and share these stories to prevent them from being lost or distorted.
And thankfully, we have the technology to do it more easily than ever before. Smartphones, recording apps, online platforms for sharing oral histories. It's never been easier to capture and share these vital pieces of the past.
So what's the main takeaway for our listeners? How can our influence decoders become those time-traveling truth gorillas in their own communities?
I think the most important thing is to cultivate a healthy skepticism. Don't take everything you hear at face value. Question the narratives you're presented with, especially those that seem overly simplistic or romanticized.
Right.
Dig deeper, do your own research, and don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. If something feels off, trust your gut and investigate further.
And if you uncover a local example of necropropaganda, a monument, a textbook, or even just a family story, we want to hear about it.
We might even feature it in a future episode.
Because this fight against historical revisionism is one we're all in together. We all have a part to play in safeguarding the truth.
And remember, it's not just about the past. Understanding history accurately is essential for navigating the present and building a more just future.
Let's all equip ourselves with that historical antivenom and go out there and debunk some of those nostalgic myths. We can do
We
this.
have to do this.
It's funny. We tend to think of nostalgia as this, like, harmless thing,
Yeah.
even something positive.
Yeah,
But as we've been discussing, it can be a powerful tool for manipulation.
that's right.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really hard to recognize when we're being influenced by nostalgia.
Yeah.
Those warm and fuzzy feelings can cloud our judgment without us even realizing it.
It's like that saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Right.
That definitely applies to the stories we're told about history.
Especially when someone is pushing a version of the past that conveniently supports an agenda they have in the present.
So what questions can we ask ourselves to, like, spot those red flags, to make sure we're not being tricked by a nostalgia necromancer?
Well, first, consider the source.
Okay.
Who's telling this story, and what might their motivations be? Are they trying to promote a specific ideology or worldview?
Right. Like, if a politician starts going on and on about the good old days when everyone supposedly knew their place and society was better,
Exactly.
that's probably a good time to start getting suspicious.
You also want to pay attention to what's being left out of the narrative,
Okay.
whose voices are missing,
Okay.
whose experiences are being ignored.
Because a complete picture of the past requires acknowledging the complexities, the good and the bad, the triumphs and the tragedies, not just a highlight reel.
And it's important to remember that no historical period was a utopia. Every era had its own unique challenges, injustices, and struggles.
So the next time you hear someone talking about how things were so much better back in the day,
Yeah.
take a moment to reflect. Ask yourself, better for whom?
And maybe do a little digging of your own to see if that rosy picture matches up with the historical evidence.
Because the truth is, the past wasn't perfect. And the present isn't perfect either.
Right.
But by understanding history and all its messy complexity, we can learn from our mistakes and work towards a better future.
A future that hopefully isn't based on longing for a past that never actually existed.
Well said. So, Influence Decoders, we hope this deep dive into the world of nostalgia necromancers has given you some new tools to identify and combat historical revisionism.
Remember, you have the power to question, to challenge, to reclaim the narrative.
Don't let the nostalgia necromancers win. Go forth and be those time-traveling truth gorillas. And don't forget to like, share, and follow us. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode in the comments, and let us know what topics you'd like us to deep dive into next. Until then, stay curious and stay critical.